Elena's legs trembled as she stood before the ranch gate, her newborn stirring against her chest. Her dress was covered in dust, the hem was torn from days of walking, and her child's faint cries cut through the quiet like a knife. At first, the man who was leaning against the wooden post didn't move. Instead, he just watched her with the measured, slow gaze of someone who was used to reading storms before they started. His hat cast a shadow over a face carved by years of labor and solitude, his boots were covered in mud, and his shirt was worn. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep, steady, like the low rumble of distant thunder. He said, "You look about ready to collapse." However, no words came out of Elena's lips. Her throat was parched, her body weak, and yet she summoned the last of her strength to whisper, "Only need a place to rest, just for tonight." She expected rejection, she had grown used to it. Most doors had closed before her, most hearts hardened by suspicion or indifference. However, this man's eyes were not cruel, despite being sharp. He instead pointed to the gate. "Come inside. The barn is warm, and the well has water." The relief that washed over her nearly stole her balance. Fearing that if she paused, everything would vanish, she stumbled forward while clenching her infant more tightly. As she entered the ranch yard, she was greeted by the leather and hay scents and the distant sound of cattle calving in the setting sun. She would later learn his name as Samuel Carter, who silently led her to the barn and allowed her to sit on a stack of hay bales while he got a bucket of water. Elena drank greedily, tears slipping down her face as the cool liquid eased her cracked lips. Her child whimpered softly, and she rocked him, murmuring broken promises of safety she wasn't sure she could keep. Samuel returned with a chunk of bread and a folded blanket. He put them down next to her and simply said, "Eat." She looked up, startled by the gesture, but he had already turned away, busying himself with checking the stalls as though her presence were of no great disturbance. That night, under the barn roof, Elena lay curled around her newborn, the blanket pulled tight, the hay scratching at her skin but offering more comfort than the cold ground she had known. For the first time since Daniel's death, she slept without fear that she would not wake. Elena awoke groggily as morning light broke through the barn slats, her infant screams awakening her before her body was ready. She feared that, like others, Samuel would tell her to leave right away, but instead he showed up with a small tin cup full of warm milk. As he handed it to her, he murmured, "For the little one." She couldn't hide her confusion, so she gave him a blink. Why would a stranger show such kindness? Yet she dared not ask, for she feared questions might shatter whatever fragile mercy she had been granted. Elena intended to leave over the course of the days, but her body betrayed her. She was weak from childbirth and grief, so Samuel did not press her. He spoke very little to her and made no promises to her. Yet she noticed the subtle ways he made space for her, a loaf of bread left on the barn shelf, a basin of water placed by the door, an old rocking chair dragged near the hay where she could sit and nurse her son. He watched her quietly, as though weighing something invisible, but never with judgment. In return, Elena worked. She swept the barn floor, mended a torn saddle strap, and tended to the chickens that wandered the yard. Despite the fact that Samuel never suggested that she refused to feel like a burden. At night, as her son slept in the crook of her arm, she whispered stories of Daniel, the man who had loved her so fiercely, only to be taken so swiftly. She wept quietly because the pain of being betrayed by his family was greater than the loss itself. For Daniel had promised her a home, a future, and she had believed him. But his relatives had ignored her like she was nothing. She looked at her child whenever despair appeared to be swallowing her whole. His tiny fingers curled around hers with surprising strength, and she reminded herself that she was not entirely alone. Somehow, she would build a life for him, even if it meant clawing her way out of the dust with bare hands. And though Samuel Carter had said little, though his kindness came wordlessly, she began to sense that this silent rancher carried burdens of his own, burdens that might explain why he let a broken widow and her child linger on his land without demanding their departure. She was broken and without any memories from the chapter of her life that ended with Daniel's death. However, as Carter's ranch was visible on the horizon, Elena felt a small, unidentified stirring deep within herself, a whisper that perhaps this was not the end of her story. Samuel Carter had never been one to extend invitations to others. His land was wide, his cattle plenty, and his silence deeper than most could bear. In the spring, when the wildflowers were at their most vibrant, he had buried his wife 5 years earlier. Since then, he had learned to live with the emptiness of a house too large for one man, his only companions the lowing of cows and the creak of wind through the shutters at night. Yet since Elena had arrived, cradling that fragile newborn against her chest, something had shifted. It wasn't comfort exactly, nor was it intrusion. A reminder that life went on, even when grief threatened to bind a man to the past, was something in between. He told himself he would let her stay until she regained her strength, then send her on her way. But each morning, when he found her already outside gathering eggs or sweeping the porch, her child tied to her in a sling, he found fewer reasons to send her off. She wasn't idle, nor was she meek. She moved with determination, as if she refused to let despair completely overcome her, despite the shadows under her eyes. That earned him more respect than he cared to admit. For Elena, those early weeks on Carter's ranch felt like stolen time. She had come expecting only a night's rest, but Samuel's silence wrapped around her like an odd kind of protection. He didn't question her past, though he must have known some of it. Word of Daniel's death and her disgrace at the hands of his family had traveled fast through the valley. Folks whispered that the widow had been tossed out with her babe before the funeral candles had cooled. She had prepared for Samuel to bring it up, question, or mock her, but he never did. And in that silence, she found a measure of dignity returning to her. With each passing day, the infant, whom she dubbed Matthew, grew stronger. She almost believed Daniel could see her when she rocked him beneath the vast sky, as his cheeks grew full and his cries became more muted. However, fear spiraled in her chest each time the rider's hoofbeats were carried by the wind from the far road. She knew Daniel's family might come looking. They had taken her home, her possessions, even her husband's memory. What would stop them from trying to take her son, the last living piece of him? One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in streaks of gold, Samuel found her standing by the fence, staring out at the fields with Matthew in her arms. His eyes were covered by his hat, but he spoke calmly when he said, "You've been working hard. Too hard, considering you just had a child." She shook her head and tightened her grip on the infant. "Work keeps me from remembering," she whispered. "If I stop, I'll drown in it." For the first time, Samuel didn't turn away. He leaned on the fence post beside her, his gaze fixed on the distance. "Grief doesn't drown you because you stop moving," he said slowly. "You don't let anyone throw you a rope, so it drowns you." His words struck something deep in her chest, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. It was that same week when the trouble began. Word reached the ranch that Daniel's brothers had been asking questions in town. They had no shame, telling anyone who would listen that Elena was unstable, unfit, that the baby belonged with family. The blacksmith was the first to tell Samuel, and after repeating it, he threw up. Rotten men in their entirety. But mark my words, Carter, they'll come sniffing around. They did, too. It was a Sunday morning, the air crisp, the sky a bright, merciless blue. Elena had just laid Matthew down for a nap when the sound of hooves thundered up the road. As she saw the familiar faces, Daniel's eldest brother Thomas, with 2 others by his side, the dust rose and her heart sank. Their boots struck the ground as if they had already taken control, and their expressions were twisted with arrogance. "Elena!" Thomas called, his voice full of resentment. "You've had enough of playing house. It's time to hand over our possessions." Elena stepped forward, her knees trembling but her chin held high. She declared emphatically, "Matthew is my son. Daniel's child. You'll not take him from me." Thomas sneered. "You. A widow without property, a claim, or resources. You couldn't even feed him if not for charity. You have no right to." He moved as if to push past her, but Samuel's voice cut through the air like a whip. "That's far enough." The brothers turned, suddenly aware of the tall figure that had emerged from the barn. Samuel stood with his arms folded, broad shoulders squared, his face unreadable. He said in a low, authoritative voice, "This land is mine. And anyone who comes here with threats will find themselves unwelcome." Thomas grumbled. "Stay out of this, Carter. This is family business." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Then allow me to make it clear. Elena and her boy are under my roof. That makes it my business. And I don't take kindly to men trying to steal children under false pretenses." The tension was thick, the only sound the restless stamping of horses. Elena's heart pounded, fear and gratitude tangling in her chest. After the way Daniel's family had thrown her out, she had no expectation that anyone would stand up for her. The confrontation ended that day without blood, but Samuel knew it wasn't over. He sat at the old wooden desk in his study with a dim lamp that night as the ranch lay still. He ran his hand over the yellowed paper as he pulled out the deed to his land. He didn't have any heirs or anyone to give it to. He had accepted for years that he would take everything with him. But now he saw a different future for the first time. Samuel gave Elena a folded piece of paper the following morning as she led Matthew out into the yard. She looked confused at him. "What is it?" Although there was something raw beneath his steady voice, "It is the act. The ranch. It is now yours." Her breath caught, and her knees nearly gave way. "No. I can't, this is your life, this is your land." Samuel fixed his gaze on her when he saw her. "Fences and cattle make up my life. The boy belongs to you. He and this land require a future. You two are more at home here than I ever was." Tears blurred her vision as she clutched Matthew closer. In that moment, the weight of her losses lifted just enough for her to breathe. She had been expelled, stripped of her dignity, and left to wander in sorrow. And now, a man who owed her nothing had given her everything. Elena felt hope firmly rooted in her heart for the first time since Daniel's death. This was not charity. It didn't feel bad. It was a gift of freedom, of home, of belonging. She also whispered to her son, "We are safe, Matthew," as she stood on the porch of her former ranch. "We are at home."